Hello again. My name is Mike Terry. I'm the superintendent of Founders Classical Academies, and I'm here with Jason Karos, our associate superintendent of academics. And we're finishing up today a multi-part discussion on Russell Kirk's The American Cause. It was a book that we decided to take on because he speaks to, I think, in an accessible way about the principles for which America stands for, that it's not just a country made up of ethnicities and people with some kind of goal that relates to their economic success or just something related to how their culture is expressed, but it's a country based on principles. And so in the last 3 episodes, we've been talking about those, and I strongly recommend that you go back and watch those first 3. We talked about the 3 major governing principles. One was a set of moral convictions that every country must have, a set of political convictions, and a set of economic principles. And together, these 3 create an environment in which free people can thrive. And we could go through and talk at more length about all of those 3, but I would just encourage people to go back and watch the first 3 episodes. Today, we're going to look at the afterword. This book was published in 1956, originally, maybe 1959, somewhere in there. I might flip that number upside down, but Gleaves Whitney wrote a foreword and afterword, an introduction and afterword to this book that, especially the afterword, I think is very interesting. And Jason, we're going to talk about that today, but maybe you can set us up and tell us who this Gleaves Whitney is and why we want to consider his words.
Yeah, so Gleaves Whitney wrote both the introduction and the afterword to this book, and he's an historian. He was the director of the Honstein Center for Presidential Studies, and I think more recently he's gone over to the Gerald R. Ford Center for I think it's called the Presidential Foundation. And he's written a number of books, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of either 17 written or edited books. So he's got some academic credentials and certainly a fan of the author here. And what he does in this afterwards is he sort of summarizes in a variety of ways the key elements of the book, and then adds some of his own insights as well. So that's, I think, the gist of what we'll be talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to introduce it, because I mean, normally when you go through a book like this, the afterword is something that maybe you look at, maybe you've taken away enough from the main text that you might not read it. But I think this is valuable, given that the book being written in the 50s, that was a certain period in American history, post World War II. There was certainly from what we are taught, a sense of exceptionalism, a sense that we had accomplished something important, and that going forward now that there was this sort of golden age in America that was approaching, and so we heard the term a lot of American exceptionalism, but Whitney doesn't just want to leave it there, that there's these 3 principles, and then we feel good about the country at a certain period of time.
Mm-hmm.
We actually should have evidence, so we should seek some evidence that that is true. And he says that my aim in this essay, in effect, is to set out what he believes are America's greatest historical achievements, which presumably are because of an adherence to these principles. And it's interesting. We talked beforehand. I always like our pre-conversations,
Mm-hmm.
but we talked beforehand about another book that Russell Kirk wrote, and you might want to speak a little bit about that. But Whitney, in the beginning of his response here to the book, alludes to it,
Mm-hmm.
without actually speaking directly to it, but he places his analysis in the context of this other book.
Yes. Yeah. So right. So the Roots of the American Order is the book that you're describing there, and Russell Kirk in that work basically outlines the sort of the evolution of our civilization. What are the roots? What are the main contributing ideas and sentiments that have gotten our civilization to where it is? And so he does it through the lens of 5 cities. the first being Jerusalem, the second Athens, the third Rome, the fourth London, and then he concludes with the sort of the culmination of all of this thinking and development, Philadelphia, right? And there he's thinking about, of course, these principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence, put into effect through the Constitution and the civil society that developed over time here in the United States.
Yeah, and that's what Whitney is addressing. So he wants to assess again the degree to which America has fulfilled its promise, and he says that in order to do that, yes, you can look at America's historical achievements, but that's one thing. He references the well, in this case, the first four of the five great cities, because each one had a particular contribution, a lasting contribution to to Western civilization. You mentioned Jerusalem, and that would be a moral code, and then the intellectual greatness of the Greeks, which I'm sure you'd like to talk more about at some point. The civic greatness, the codification of law. We talk about Hammurabi a lot, but what the Romans did in making law equitable for all citizens was significant. And then in the early representations of constitutions in British society, starting with the Magna Carta, up through the British Civil, the Bill of Rights that was presented after the British Civil War and the restoration of the Crown, were all important.
I think we could also add economic development and economic liberty that came out of Great Britain as well.
Oh, I think that's a good point, and that's he doesn't address that here. He talks about the constitutional greatness of medieval and early modern British history, but I think that's a good point. Because they did empower the everyday person to participate in the economic system.
Well, and of course, Adam Smith, writes his famous work on economics around the time of the American Revolution.
Yeah,
right. So
when we look at America, then we look at it in the context of these other four great cities. What does Whitney think is America's contribution? Why do we belong in that club?
Right. Well, I think it's important first to say, because you mentioned the phrase American exceptionalism early on, that he is not saying this in a triumphant way. It's not a type of triumphalism. In fact, he points out that we have flaws. Like we do suffer from the human condition. We've had lots of ups and downs. But what he's doing is, sort of crafting this argument in the scope of thousands of years of humanity, like what we've seen out of civilizations and how rapidly the United States has gone from, a very small English colony to this grand nation, relatively overnight in the grand scheme of things, right? It's also important to point out that he starts with a discussion of the contributions of Alexis de Tocqueville, right? The famous Frenchman who came over in the antebellum period in the 1820s and 30s, visited and wrote his famous work Democracy in America, that is considered a modern. It's certainly a classic, but it provides an outsider's view of early America, and he has great hope for the United States because of the principles not only that he saw in the documents, but the way that Americans were living and the kinds of things that they were producing and doing, right? So Alexis de Tocqueville, in fact, makes an argument for American exceptionalism, right? The earliest argument in a very sort of systematic way, right? So that's important to say. But in terms of what is our contribution? You mentioned the seven arguments that Cleves Whitney makes. I think it's helpful at this point maybe to say what those are. So the reason why we are the fifth of these, so represented by the city of Philadelphia, the tree of liberty, so to speak, is because we've done something amazing constitutionally. We've done something amazing in terms of human rights, not just in word, but in deed. We have a true understanding of freedom or liberty, along with a high functioning civil society. Again, despite our flaws and periodic missteps. We've done something amazing economically. That would be the fifth one. The sixth one is that we've not only attracted scores and scores and scores of immigrants, but we've enculturated them into our society, and unlike any other place in the world. And then finally, in terms of foreign relations, he argues we've really kind of changed the game, in that regard. So as a result of those 7 factors, which obviously have to be unpacked, but he says, we are sort of the culminating. Russell Kirk would argue that we're the culmination of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you're going to boil it down the way Cleves Whitney does, and in the book, he says the moral greatness of the ancient Hebrews. I'm reading the Pentateuch right now, and there's a lot of consequences for lack of adherence.
I'm reading Leviticus right now.
Yeah, well, I just finished that. I'm in Numbers, and when people get swallowed up by the earth because they're not adhering to God's law, you wonder about this part of it. But people aren't perfect, and we know that. But what's more important are the principles that they projected into future generations, and clearly we can say that the Judeo-Christian heritage is one of moral noteworthiness.
Mm-hmm.
So he talks about the intellectual greatness of the ancient Greeks, and there's probably more to it than that we could talk about, as Kirk does in the other book.
Mm-hmm.
The civic greatness of ancient Rome and the Constitution, which I thought was interesting that he talked about the constitutional greatness. I guess it was, in Britain's case, the idea that the people had a say. But what I've often heard said about America is that we balance self-governance and duty.
Mm-hmm.
That we balance self-governance in the law,
mm-hmm.
And that wrapped up in that, and you mentioned an understanding of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
That we come to understand what freedom is, and that's actually one of the things that he'll argue among his 7,
mm-hmm.
Is that freedom is conditioned by morality and duty. So a sense of ought, both in terms of your personal conduct and then what you owe
mm-hmm.
society.
And that's something we've been talking about throughout these discussions of the book. It's a common theme right throughout, right? With regard to government, one of the key things that Cleves Whitney talks about from the very start is the fact that, we created a constitution made to last. And he brings up this ancient Greek author named Polybius, who wrote a history of the Roman people. And in there, he has an extended section on the greatness of Roman government at the time. But he talks about something called anacyclosis, which has to do with what all the ancient writers talked about as the cycle of revolutions in government. Mm-hmm. This idea that, and there were different ideas, like Plato said it a little differently than Aristotle, and then Polybius came along and had his emphasis. But the idea there is that if you look at history of city-states and kingdoms and republics in the ancient world, they typically started out in sort of a similar way. You'd have like a strong man ruling a society, and that would eventually become a monarchy. The monarchy would last and be overthrown by an oligarchy. Then the oligarchy would be, overthrown by a tyranny, and then the tyrant would be overtaken by some sort of people's regime like a democracy. And then eventually that would get corrupted and fall apart, and it would start all over again in some way. And what he's arguing here is that the founding fathers, because they were great students of history, and of course they had the benefit of these 4 cities, right? They put together a constitution that took the best ideas of the various ancient civilizations, so that we would get a limited government with federalism, with checks and balances, strictures on the government itself, right? The Bill of Rights, et cetera, so that it wouldn't fall apart in a short amount of time, that it would last, right? And so Whitney argues that this is one of the major achievements. Now, obviously, we've only been a nation for 2.5 centuries, more or less, and we've got a while to go before we can say that this is going to be, very long lasting. But we've been through quite a bit, as a country, something like a civil war, right, and more, Great Depression, et cetera. And we're still standing, and as it stands right now, the government is in the midst of some kind of a major, maybe rejuvenation. Some people call it a reform or a return. We shall see. But this is one of Whitney's arguments here, that the founding fathers found a way to stop this cycle of revolutions that is one of the hallmarks of civilizations in general. Yeah.
Well, I think we could go a couple of different directions with this. I mean, we could look at to what extent that these things are able to be maintained. We can look at why they've lasted as long as they have. I mean, when you look at the history of nations, especially when they go through this cycle that you described, and in common vernacular, they're referred to as turnings now. And that's a whole other line of intellectual exploration of societal trends. But I think that we can be balanced in our analysis. Whitney's writing in 2002. I think he's when he's looking at the achievements of this country. I mean, this is an essay. Like what Whitney wrote here is not a book and not an analytical exercise. He's trying to summarize and provide a little bit of reflection on what Kirk had to say, and it may be that in some of these, he may be a little off the mark. I mean, we talk about the economic success of our country, and right now, when there's a lot of focus on the price of eggs, and when the prices are manipulated through money printing, well, we have to ask the question: are the economics results real? When the government releases a report about all these jobs that have been created, and turns out they're all government jobs, every single one of them, is that real? Is that real economic success? Does the average person have as much opportunity now as, say, in 1950 or 1960, or even in the 70s, to start a business and to pursue their economic dreams? And we look around us and we hear how hard it is because of government involvement to start a business. You could say that, well, 20 plus years ago when Whitney wrote this essay, he was naive. But I think we could also step back and say the principles, the right principles are in place, that if the people are allowed to self-govern, and if the people act morally and responsibly, then everything that Kirk says stands. So I think we can look at it both from the perspective of what's going wrong, and are these things in danger, and also, do we have the right things in place so that that people can live freely and flourish?
Well, I think we could look at this maybe a little bit through a biblical lens. You mentioned you're reading, the Torah or the Pentateuch right now. Look, in that book, right, we read that God lays down a law, right? He gives not only the 10 Commandments, but hundreds of other guidelines and rules for the Hebrew people to follow. And sometimes they follow them as a group, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes, to their great destruction, they don't follow them, right? But the laws are still there, the guidelines are still there, the principles are still in place, and only if the people would follow them would they be in a right position, right, in a right state. And so I think it's the same thing. Like, so we've got principles laid out in the Declaration, we have a Constitution and other founding documents, and a history, and so. We're not always, in line with those principles, and maybe we've never fully been in line with them, right? But the idea is, as we talked about once before, just thinking about that famous line from the preamble of the Constitution, in order to form a more perfect union. We're striving to achieve that. And so when we teach our children, these are the things we teach them, because we hope that we're going to live that way, and that everybody will have the benefit of that at some point. Just maybe one more quick note regarding the economics of things right now. So there are certainly some things we could point to that are out of whack with regard to economic liberty and the free enterprise and free market system. One thing that's different, though, about the 1950s, just to use that time frame as an example, is that we have different priorities as people and families. So if we go back several generations, uh, maybe the material interests were different than today. Today, there's an expectation that you have this and you live this way, and two people therefore have to work to do that. Um, the average home in the 1940s and 50s was tiny compared to even a low or middle income home today. So I mean, could we all cut back and live more humbly, right? And then not have to scramble to buy a dozen eggs? Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
We can do that, but do we choose to do that? And I'm not saying there are no people living in poverty and suffering. Not saying that. I'm just saying that maybe materially, like, we don't necessarily as individuals have our priorities in place. So we have this high standard that may not be a good one, right? And so sometimes it's hard to compare, people living in different generations and income levels and expectations and so on, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think no matter what we say about the current era, and then maybe in reference to the example you just gave, we've become so affluent that we expect it to continue, and we don't really understand how we got there in the first place by manufacturing things of quality and of value to people in our country and around the world. That's to a great extent what did it. Everything is monetized, commoditized now, and it's out of reach for the average person. And so, like you said, it requires two people to do a certain thing. But again, I think in defense of Whitney, you can still say the principles like in this example, the free market economy, when those principles are defended, then people will flourish. And I think no matter what difficulties we face, and we're seeing in our government what a bureaucratic government with total access to funding, what damage they could do. That doesn't mean that the country is wrecked. And I think that message can't get lost in our analysis of America's exceptionalism. Just because we fail to follow a precept, thinking about your example of the nation of Israel, doesn't mean that the precept is a failure.
Right.
That's a human failure.
Yes. Well, there's one other thing that proves, I think, what you're saying to be correct, and that is federalism. Look, so we could have a government in Washington, D.C. that's not serving us well overall and not following the principles. But don't forget, we have 50 states with state governments. Our founders created a federal government, and many of the powers of government are in the hands of those officials. And on a day-to-day basis, they actually impact our lives more, right? So what can we do? What can we look at there? What metric can we use? Well, there are state-by-state comparisons, economic comparisons, education comparisons, crime and poverty comparisons, et cetera, et cetera. There are states right now that are thriving considerably more than others.
Right.
And people are moving to those states, Texas being one of them, Florida being another. We hear about this in the news. I know there are more. So people are voting with their feet, so to speak, and going to these places. And so when you have a good governor, state legislatures, and so on, and then, of course, local mayors and councils and all the rest that are governing according to the principles we're talking about, things turn out much better for people.
Yeah. I think the other part of understanding Cleves Whitney's conclusions is to actually look at the end of his document, and he acknowledges that America is not utopia. I don't think that the founders set out to create utopia. I mean, maybe those in Massachusetts thought, that they were going to establish the city on the hill. But I think by and large, by the time we get to the American Revolution, they want a free place for people to pursue their interests. But he's saying, in the perspective of world history, because that's where he started with the four great cities or four great nations, that in the perspective of history, what we've offered the world is substantial and important, and this understanding of freedom this balancing of self-governance and responsibility is so important. It's such a big deal and such an important lesson for the rest of the world, that it shows that we don't have to live in a place where the government tells us what to do, because we have laid out in front of us, the rules and the principles to allow us to live free.
Mm-hmm.
That is such a significant contribution to the understanding of human society,
Mm-hmm.
that we can say, I feel comfortable saying America is exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we look around and we're wondering about the things going on in our lives,
Yes.
that when we take that step back,
Mm-hmm.
we can be amazed and impressed and grateful, right? That the American founders were smart enough to figure this out.
Yes. Well, I think, one of the other areas that he talks about, or one of the other points that he brings up that connects to what you're saying, is his second point about human rights in word and deed. So I think people oftentimes judge countries by their governments, and I don't know that that's the best way to do that. I mean, that's, obviously government is one of the key institutions of any civilization or nation, but there are so many more, and we are a nation of people, right? And, when we think about human rights, the United States has its blemishes, of course, with slavery and the treatment of American Indians and periodic problems with immigrants and so on. But when you think about what do we do, when we have those major problems, like we eliminate slavery, we work to provide civil rights to women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Over time, we try our best to correct those.
Right.
And you might say, well, it took a long time. Well, yeah, it did. It took too long to end slavery. But again, comparing it to other civilizations in the world, we're near the top there, right? I mean, Great Britain did this before us, right? Thankfully. But we have a track record for promoting human rights. And because we're in such a strong economic, state, and we have, in terms of military might, we're a great superpower. We can do things, around the world that other countries have never been able to do. And, we have literally not only brought whole kinds of people out of poverty in this country, but we've done it in other parts of the world. People talk quite a bit now about how sort of the global order of economics is changing. For a couple of generations, we've had this sort of global economy, at work. And now it's becoming a little more regional, right? And sort of the nation is sort of back again, and we're moving away from globalism, let's say. Well, that global society that we had for so long was put in place because of the United States as a result of the victory in World War II. Right. We were the lone superpower. Of course, we were struggling against another, in the West, that is, we're struggling against another superpower, the Soviet Union at the time, the communists. And because of our ships protecting waterways, other countries were able to trade with us and to benefit, from the economic prosperity of the United States. And as a result of that, other areas developed types of free market societies, right? And many, many, many people were lifted out of poverty as a result of that. Like, we did that, intentionally. Yes, we had a motive because we had a competitor in the Soviet Union, but there's also an altruistic, aim there, as well, that lifts a lot of people up, right? And I think that's part of the human psyche. We don't like when people are downtrodden. We don't like when people don't earn the dignity and the respect that or don't have the dignity and respect that they have, by nature or have earned. We like the underdog. That's part of who we are, right? And we work to correct wrongs, despite the fact that we're often wrong, right? We are imperfect people.
Yeah. Well, I think to add a comment to that, when you look at the Cold War, and we were young during that period.
Mm-hmm.
I was in college. We were both in college when the Berlin Wall came down.
Yes,
and I still talk about that with my son because he tries to get his head around what that means. And I was there at Texas A&M the day that President Bush and the mayor of Berlin at the time brought the first pieces of the Berlin Wall to the United States, and that piece actually still is in the library there in College Station. So we lived through that period, but we didn't feel it the way, say, people in Poland felt it.
Mm-hmm.
Ronald Reagan is a national hero in Poland because he stood for freedom for the Polish people when they were oppressed, and that happened all across Eastern Europe. Now, there was a political agenda there, and that was to break the hold of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, and eventually it worked. And of course, saying that is a vast simplification of what happened, what transpired. But like we pulled up Reagan's speech when he said the famous words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
Mm-hmm.
And and having lived through that, I get goosebumps when I hear that. But again, that was our offering to the people who were oppressed to show them that freedom was possible. And I think we need to acknowledge how important that was. And that it also goes along with another point he made. And then I want to talk one last time about our students after this. But on page 151, he mentions the establishment of a vibrant civil society, right? Yes. And that's actually one of the things Tocqueville specifically mentions in his book, that unlike anywhere else that he'd ever seen across Europe and in his travels, Americans just did things.
Yes.
And they didn't wait for permission. They didn't ask the government to step in. They formed organizations, and not just guilds like you would see in Europe, but that would be established and then become a power structure that can control a certain part of the economy. But organizations would just pop up to get things done. If a group of people needed a road from the farm to the market, yes, they got together and they built the road. They didn't necessarily go to the government and ask for help. And I think that idea, that's a self-governance right there. It's not just about restraining your behavior in a way that doesn't infringe on other people, but it actually is about getting together with other people to put the things together that you need for the benefit of everyone in a community, in a society. So I think that's a really, really important aspect of what America showed to the world. You don't need a government to live well, especially if you have a moral people that have a sense of duty to one another.
Yes.
That is not imposed, and we saw a lot of that a few years ago. That's not imposed on us by a central power. So I don't know if you want to say anything else about that, but I really do want to talk about then, what this looks like in our schools, which we addressed a little bit in the last episode.
Well, I think it's a good segue to talking about our schools, because he lists, in terms of the civil elements of civil society, things like PTA or PTO, spelling bees, Rotarians, Knights of Columbus, soup kitchens, Habitat for Humanity, and he says thousands of ways that Americans come together. Right. We could also add athletic associations, right? And today we have all kinds of collegiate, professional, high school, all kinds of athletic groups, all the way down to small children, right? We are a people of associations. This is what Tocqueville, tells us, and that is very unique to this day. If you visit other countries around the world, they don't have all these kinds of things developed, for lots of different people in their societies. That is a very distinct thing, and it has to do again with, as you say, sort of the liberty, the with-itness that we have. Like, we're not waiting for somebody in Washington, or in this case Austin here in Texas, to do this or that. We're going to get together and to do it, and we have a whole set of common beliefs and common ends. And that's actually, one thing we probably ought to say is that, the principles that Russell Crookes talks about are the things that bring us all together as Americans, because we do have people who have come, or their ancestors come from so many different places around the world with different religions, different political backgrounds, and so on. These principles bring us together. And this unity is very much necessary, and that's what makes it work. Otherwise, what you have is what you see in lots of other countries around the world, interestingly. And this is something that sometimes a lot of young people, and maybe adults too, don't really know. And that is that there's a lot of strife in many countries, because there are ethnic divisions within countries, there are religious divisions within countries. People bemoan the history of racism that we've had in this country, but there are many, many, many countries around the world, even nearby us, who also discriminate not based on nationality, but because their skin tone is a little bit darker or lighter than the other, right? Or they have a little different accent, or their particular branch of the religion is a little bit different, and they fight and they war over these things within their own country, right? And so to have a nation for over 200 years that has remained together with one civil war, right? Despite the fact that we have all of these diverse peoples coming in here is quite an accomplishment.
Yeah.
But it's done because of these principles.
So how do we get that across to our students? Because at the end of the day, that's why we're here.
Yes. Well, so connecting what you're asking to Tocqueville's idea, the school in some ways is a microcosm of the larger community, right? And so besides the rich academic experience that we give to the children, besides promoting all of these civic and economic principles we're talking about for these few sessions here, we also have activities for them, right? What we call co-curricular or even extracurricular activities. So students are involved in associations, right? Whether it's a club or a service group or a performance group or an athletic team, they have opportunities to contribute to their school and to grow as human beings and in friendships in many, many ways in the schools. It helps them to thrive. It helps to build esprit de corps at the school. And again, it's preparing them for life in a country of associations, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of vibrancy on our campuses, even in the younger ones, right? That are just starting up, the newer schools. We're doing, many of these things, and they're growing year by year.
I think someone could say, well, all schools do that. And to a certain extent, that's true.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that probably all schools might do really well.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the difference between our charter schools and the government ISD schools, when you look at student life, that tends to be something that we can point to everywhere, saying we in our school systems really do a good job of making sure students have the opportunity to get involved. But I think the difference is that a government ISD school isn't going to articulate any of this. They're not going to say that you get involved in organizations because you want to, because you have the freedom to do so. It's just it's kind of like when we were talking about the affluence that we've achieved, and therefore we expect certain things to just be. People expect that schools offer certain things, but I think the important thing in a Founders is that we're telling them why.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, the thing is, every activity in which the students are engaged, both in class and outside of the classroom, connects to the school mission, right? So we're not signing off on any kind of idea that someone may have for a co-curricular, extracurricular activity, right? We have distinctively classical schools, right? That we want to be excellent,
right? That
pursue knowledge, promote virtue, and prepare students for prosperous lives in civic society. So, when we have a student council, which yes, other schools have, what they're doing connects directly to our mission statement, right? When we have a organization that I'm losing my train of thought here, but that promotes things like a Bill of Rights Day colloquium, at a school, like for instance at Founders Louisville,
right.
They have an annual colloquium. Like students are engaged in that. They help to put it together. They participate in it because that is directly connected to our civic mission. When they bring in guest speakers from a variety of backgrounds, whether it's, local government or entrepreneurs or, leaders in various facets of our society, it's connected specifically to, to the mission, right? Because we have an end. Like we have a vision for a student, who graduates from our schools.
I agree. And I actually think that's a good place to wrap up. I mean, we've talked a lot here in this book, both about what Russell Kirk had to say and then Gleaves Whitney at the end. Do you have any concluding thoughts you'd like to make? And then,
well, I would like to say something. In addition to certainly reading The American Cause and Roots of the American Order, if someone can read that one as well. Gleaves Whitney has another reading that you could find online. I brought a copy of it here. It was originally called We Are Americans. And if you do a search, I think for rather than We Are Americans, for Gleaves Whitney and let's see, how does it go? What's the new title that I saw online? Oh boy. Every civilization is one generation away from barbarism. I think it's called One Generation Away from Barbarism.
Okay.
Is the name of it. And in that essay, he outlines some of the things that he talks about in this afterword, but he frames it in the course of 4 questions he would like leaders and educators to ask children. And they are like, what do you want them to know? What do you want them to feel? What do you want them to believe? What do you want them to do? So it's a short but powerful, statement that also kind of wraps up many of these ideas that, Russell Kirk talks about in this book.
I think that's an important place to end. And without opening the book back up again, I mean, Kirk says that you've got to educate your people. They've got to be educated for liberty and for self-governance, and that's certainly what we're trying to accomplish. And I think the questions he poses, we all should be asking ourselves, because they get to that point. So, but I think we'll stop here.
Okay.
This has been a great conversation. This is now 4 separate pieces of podcast material for people to take a look at, and we have others coming. So I hope that y'all will find that this was interesting content, and that you want to take a look at this book, The American Cause by Russell Kirk. I hope you pick yourself up a copy. The Roots of the American Order is quite a bit thicker than this one.
This is a good primer.
Yeah, good place to start. So I appreciate you all staying with us to the end. I hope you enjoyed this 4-part conversation, and I look forward to more conversations.
I do as well. Thank you.